Hello, everyone. Welcome to our another recorded discussion in Assessment and Learning 2. And in this video, we will be learning about authentic assessment, its meaning, methods, and different tools that we can use as performance tasks. And this is our learning outcomes for this video. At the end of this chapter, you will be able to explain the meaning of authentic assessment and differentiate its complementary importance with traditional types of assessment. Cite the different 21st century skills and transversal competencies provided in the partnership with 21st century framework and ways it can be assessed through 21st century assessment. And create an authentic assessment utilizing the GRASP framework. What are authentic assessments? How do we differentiate it with a pen and paper type of test? Now, let's go on to the different views of different authors in defining what is an authentic assessment. In 2011, Mueller defined authentic assessment as a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform a real world task that demonstrate a meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. Another author, in a person with Wiggins in 1987, defined this as replicas or analogous to the kind of problems faced by adult citizens and consumers or professionals in the field. Stiggins also defined authentic assessment as a call upon the examinee to demonstrate specific skills and competencies. For example, to apply the skills and knowledge they have mastered. Now let's look on the comprehensive comparison given by Mueller in 2008, in which these are the attributes of a traditional and authentic assessment. When it comes to action or option, traditional assessment usually is just selecting a response, or maybe you can create one, but still will limit you to a pen and paper type of test. However, in authentic assessment, we require a student to perform a task and sometimes produce a product. Setting, it's contrive and imagine. Sometimes it is abstract. However, in authentic assessment, it is a simulation, or it could be also done in real life. For methods, it is more on recall and recognition for traditional assessment. For authentic assessment, it is construction or application of the mastered skills. The focus for traditional assessment is more of teacher structured. However, in authentic assessment, it is a student structured. The outcome, traditional assessment may consider as indirect evidence. Sometimes there are factors affecting to the examinee. Um, the examiner's condition during the examination day. And because it is just a recall or recognition type, it's still considered indirect evidence. However, for authentic assessment, it is direct evidence because we can check whether the student were able to understand the instruction and were able to demonstrate the skill we ask them to do. Authentic assessments are also called non-test assessments. It is an assessment that measures the student abilities directly with a real life task. It should not force the student to give their responses, but it should manifest their acquired knowledge. Remember this because any action that is forcefully done that is actually not considered part of learning process. These are examples of non-test assessment you may have encountered and you may be able to use in your teaching demonstration, for example, or even during your field study and internship experience. You can have portfolio, teacher observation, states or hand signals, daily assessments, journal, games, project, debates. We have checklist, cartooning, models, notes. We can even have panel discussion, demonstration, problem solving, lots of problem solving, and of course, group, peer, or individual discussions. So as you have noticed, none of these tests mention about a pen and paper type of test. That's why they are called non-test assessments. Remember that authentic assessment complements traditional assessment. That is because there is no single assessment that can assess the entirety of, for example, that subject or that course or that program. It should always be a series of multiple varied type of assessment. In other words, we cannot omit the importance of traditional assessment even if we call it traditional. It should still exist, coexist with authentic assessment. In other words, we should always have a knowledge, recall, recognition type of test for us to be able to have authentic assessments. Example in the teacher education program is that before you were asked to perform or to demonstrate or to have a teaching demonstration, you are always assessed on the theories and the ideas and concepts you have learned in the course. That is why the field study and the internship program or the internship subjects or course are located at the end completion of this program. It is given after all the theories you have learned in the courses are should be applied on. What I'm trying to say is that we cannot omit the pen and paper existence in any type of learning process. Now, to better understand that, Marzano provided the three systems of knowledge, which we have a self system, metacognitive system, and cognitive system. Now, knowledge domain is part of the three systems of knowledge. However, the knowledge domain is embedded in the entire system. For example, in this framework, as you can see, the information, mental processes, and psychomotor procedures are all in one cube with level 1 to 6 type of systems. In other words, we cannot have a retrieval level, comprehension level, analysis level, the utilization of that knowledge, a metacognitive process level, and a self-belief level if we were not able to meet the information, mental procedures, and psychomotor procedures needed for the domain of knowledge. Hence, it is safe to say that a student cannot perform, cannot demonstrate properly the master skills if the necessary ideas or concepts or theories are not understood well. A good example in our teacher education program is that we cannot assess properly, or we cannot make a correct, let's say, for example, crafting of our authentic assessment if we don't understand what is authentic assessment. But the book would say we define first the term so that we will be able to achieve the highest level of self system. This is another framework provided by Marzano and Kendall in 2007, in which the assessment of a new task, as you can see, the arrow goes down from self system, whether the student decide to engage. If yes, that's a metacognitive system, and proceed with cognitive system. The arrow going down means that cognitive system, metacognitive system is achieved before the highest form, which is the self system. However, if the student don't want to engage, then that means to say that he or she continues with the old behavior or with the old task. Now, another educationalist or theorist in the name of Riles define assessment or authentic assessment in three concepts. This is knowing how, knowing that, and knowing what. Knowing how is the technical ability. Knowing that is a fact and propositions. And knowing what is the acquaintance with things and persons. So remember that according to Ryle, knowing that is empty intellectualism. That means knowing only fact and propositions doesn't equate to the highest level of learning, or even not even the minimum requirement in a learning process. Effective possessions of a piece of knowledge, they call it museum possession of knowledge, and theoretical or practical problems, that is workshop possession of knowledge, is the goal. That means to say, it is not just enough for rote memorization, and it is not just enough that we only assess them in pen and paper, but we also pair it with authentic assessment. Now, not just trial, the partnership for 21st century also will tell us that there is a necessary core subjects. If you can remember your senior high curriculum, in which you have those core subjects with you and you have those specializations depending on the strand you enrolled in. So here there are, and the core subjects you are ought to understand life and career skills, learning and innovation skills, and the information media and technology skills, which are all needed as 21st century skills. So in that framework, the standard and assessments are defined, the curriculum and instruction, the professional development of the teachers, and of course, the learning environment is also considered in the framework. Now, another things that we need to consider in authentic assessment are the transversal competencies that are being transferred to when we teach them or when we assess them this type of test. That means to say that we are not just testing the content, we are not just testing the ideas, but also the skills. Sometimes it is actually a combination of knowing how to be, which are the attitudes and values, and knowing how, which are the procedures. So these are the different Transversal competencies that we can ask when we make an authentic assessment. Allow me to zoom in the different skills. For critical and innovative thinking, the transferable skills could be creativity, entrepreneurship, resourcefulness, application skills, reflective thinking, and reasoned decision making. So that's just one. And the others, we also have interpersonal skills, intrapersonal skills, media information literacy, global citizenship, and there are also others. So remember that these are not content based, but these are achieved whenever we ask them to demonstrate a skill paired up with an attitude and values. This is a summary of a research-based construct which is being compared with the partnership with 21st century framework, with the National Research Council framework, and with assessing and teaching the 21st century skills. So here, for critical thinking, the terminology we have is learning and innovation. For the NRC is cognitive critical thinking. And for assessing and teaching 21st century, the ways of thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, and decision making. So we're not going to go deeply with each research-based construct, but you can actually see, you can definitely check that each construct is just almost the same. The frameworks from P21, NRC, and ATC21, they all have common denominator as to these research-based constructs are defined. In other words, these are at least the criteria that we are looking for, or at least that we can met when we give authentic assessment. Now let's proceed to the different features of authentic assessment as defined by Hambleton in 1996. First is that there should be an emphasis on doing an open-ended activities for which there is no correct, such as like in the objective type of test. That means to say, you cannot let someone do the same painting with the other student. When you ask them to have a slogan, or when you ask them to write a poem, we cannot expect that they have the same identical answers or identical outputs because we are not doing an objective type of test. Second is that it should have a direct methods of evaluation. That in a sense that we know what we are assessing, it should have a direct method of what should be the judgment, what should be the basis of their grades. Next is self-assessment. Now, good thing in authentic performance or authentic assessment is that our student will be able to assess themselves as to whether they have already achieved the needed demonstration of skills. In some ways, it could also reflect how they approach a certain problem, such as the acquiring of those soft skills mentioned earlier. Assessment as a group performance as well as individual performance. There are outputs that can be graded per group and should also be graded individually. An example is that We may have one rubric that can test or that can assess the capstone project of a group, for example, in a science strand or in a STEM strand, but there should also another individual rubric to assess their contribution to the attainment of that capstone project. Another example is that a research output can also be graded by per group, but also the leader who is working well with that can also be can also provide individual rating to his or her members. Last features of authentic performance is that extended period of time for assessment. That means to say we gave them enough time but not too much. The emphasis is that they will be able to make it or to submit whether it is an output based or a process based type of assessment. It should not be too long. The time should not be too long in a way that they forget to make your performance assessment or performance task. That's also another comparison with a traditional type of test. In traditional type of test, we can give it like an hour or 2 hours or so. However, in authentic assessment, it could be week or sometimes for a research output, it is usually by semestral or by year. Now, let's proceed to the characteristic of what is a 21st century assessment. First is it is responsive. In other words, it is based from an assessment criteria. It should generate data that will inform us our instruction and the achievement of the curriculum. Next is it's flexible. It can be done inside the classroom. It can also be done outside the classroom, and sometimes it is done online. For videos, for performance tasks that we require our student to make videos, sometimes submission of flash drives or submission of compact disc are not practical anymore in today's generation. We can just let them upload it on their drive or Dropbox or whatever storage online they have, and we can look at it conveniently. Also, another characteristic of a 21st century assessment is that it is integrated in a way that it should not be a single activity to them, but it should be also integrated with other assessments. Example, the authentic assessment we have at the end of, usually at the end of the semesters. There will be collaboration with other teachers teaching in different subjects. For example, if we are teaching entrepreneurship, which is offered in oral communication or which is also offered in the media and information literacy subjects in senior high, sometimes the pitching of the product will already assess the oral communication skills, and the product itself is the entrepreneurial skills and how they pose it through that through any advertisement is an MIL skills or media information literacy skills. Another also is that it should be informative. It should give information on whether or not the desired targeted 21st century skills are achieved or not. And it should clearly state and explicitly teach us or tell us whether that certain authentic assessment is helping our student achieve the desired learning outcome. It should also be through multiple methods. It could be a series or a continuum spectrum of different assessment strategies. It should not just use one single approach or one single strategy. It is communicated properly the way when we give mechanics, the way when we inform them that this would be the rubrics, that's already communicating them the assessment. It should also be technically sound in a way that it is fair and we adjust and accommodate through what is the performance needed. In other words, we should not embrace to have it substandard because we feel of doing so, but because we consider the learning environment, we consider the learning needs. Also, it should be systematic in a way that it is part of a comprehensive and well aligned assessment system that is balanced and, of course, inclusive to all students. Systematic in a way that it should not be just considered at the end of the semester. However, it should be provided even before the class will start. That is why most of the authentic assessment we have in TEP are coordinated in the first week of the class. That is to make sure that it is in our syllabus, that it is in our course outline. Now, we're done with the characteristic of the 21st century assessment. The question is whether what are we going to let our students perform, whether it is a product oriented output or a, a process oriented output. Now, for process oriented, this is more of a procedural knowledge. That means to say, we are going to check whether they can demonstrate the skill. Examples in Filipino, for example, is na isasagawa ang sistematikong pananaliksik tungkol sa paksang tinalakay. In this certain outcome, it is not just the research output that we are checking, but whether they can search about it or whether their research skills are enough for them to acquire the output. Also, we have the use the appropriate reading style could be scanning, skimming, speed reading, intensive reading, and for one's purpose. So this is for grade 8 English curriculum. For product assessment, this is more of a concrete product. That means it could be either in a soft copy or it could be in a big replica or it could be, for example, what we call this, a capstone project. So an example here is that writes coherent review of literature. Here, the output is the literature itself. Or it could be prepares a physical activity program for physical education in grade 8. Now, remember that there is an emphasis on DepEds on the performance task. In the DepEd order, 8 series of 2015, which is still currently what we are using now for classroom assessment in basic education, there are three components of grading that is considered: the written task, the performance task, and the quarterly assessment. Note that performance task, it across all curriculum, across all subjects, weighs, it could be equal with the written work or most of the time greater than the written work. That is because the DepEd states that the students may create or innovate products or do performance-based tasks. Performance-based tasks may include skills demonstration, group presentation, and so on and so forth, and considered which can be considered as performance tasks. So that is why, if you can recall your senior high school days, most of our teachers will always let us perform something, ask us to submit an output because it is already a requirement in the DepEd competition of grade. Now, how do we come up with a performance task guided by GRASP? But first, what is GRASP? GRASP is a short for goal, role, audience, situation, product, and standards and criteria. It is actually a framework that helps us to lay out the plans or the mechanics that we can give to our students if we let them perform a task. For a goal, it should provide a statement of task, establish the goal of the task, state the problem, challenge, or obstacles in the task. In goal, we can give a very an outcome. Could be if it is a product assessment, we can ask them for a specific outcome already. If it is a performance task, then a specific should be what skills should be demonstrated. For role, we can define the role of the student in the task. We can sometimes also state the job of the student for the task. Let's say, for example, if they're gonna create a miniature house. For a miniature house project, they're, um, they could be an engineer and a project engineer that would, what do you call this, plan all the making of the miniature house. For audience, identify the target audience within the context of the scenario. In most cases, the audience are their classmates. It could also you can also stipulate that they can add their teachers and also the other faculty. And if it is a school-based type of assessment, for example, for exhibits or capstone project presentation, sometimes you have to include in the audience the school administrations. Situation is that what is the context of the performance task that you are asking them to do? What is the challenge? Sometimes also you can provide examples, output in the product. Actually, it is product and or performance. You have to clarify what the students will create and why they will create it. You could also give a expected sample, expected output. If it is a performance base, you also need to lay out what are those that will be expected in them to demonstrate. For example, you are teaching them, you would like to test their oral communication skills through extemporaneous outputs or extemporaneous performance task. Aside from fi- um, listing down the criteria, you also have to the criteria for judging them, you also have to list down whether they will be wearing a formal attire, what piece would there be, will it be there will there be given enough minute to prepare their piece, how many minutes, and so on and so forth. So you can put that in the product or performance. And of course, the standard and criteria would be those. What are your criteria in judging them for that certain performance or product, either product or performance based type of assessment? You give them the rubric in a way that they know how they will be assessed or how they will be rated. For example, they should know if the audience impact is included, but take note, audience impact should not be the same weighing with those in the other criterias you have. That should just be like 5 to 10% of our overall rating. And I think that would be it for this topic. An example of a different performance task I have made during my basic education experience will be provided in a classroom setup. Thank you.